So yeah, I think the problem would be if I was drawing conclusions and then working backward from it, which is the opposite of what I'm doing. I am trying to figure out the first one. It took 7 years to write, a lot of research. There's over that one was faster, much faster. My first book's called the Identified Flying Objects. I published it in 2019, and it's a really dense, thorough scientific investigation of this question. So that one focuses on this question specifically, draws from physics, astronomy, astrobiology, anthropology, and some of the other social sciences to some extent. But that one, it's been called dense by a lot of people. There's a lot of technical terms. I define all of them, but unless you like love science, it's not going to be something
Right.
that you would necessarily just read and be like, oh. So I wrote the second book that had a ton of literary angels in it, where I'm flipping through. I know I kind of want to write about this, but I don't know exactly how. Boom, there it is. I just flipped to that page.
Whoa.
Or a book kind of just shows itself on the shelf. And then that one took about 2 years to write. And then this one definitely came from the ether because I sat down. My truck was getting fixed at the Ford garage, and I went to this restaurant that was in parking distance with a couple notebooks because I had an idea that I was going to write a fiction book, which I've never written prior to this point, and did some research on how to write fiction and the storylines, how they progress, just to have the framework. But then I sat down and I filled these notebooks in their entirety in the time it took between dropping off my truck and picking it up at this restaurant that I went to. And it felt like one of those things, like writing a song or doing a painting or the thing with the producer where it just kind of comes
Happens.
together, And the entire framework was there for that book. And I'd modify things and I'd add it, but it's the same as it was that I scribbled in those notebooks. It's just one of those things where you like kind of just open
You
yourself.
see it.
And then let the magic happen.
Yep.
And that's how it was with the second book, the extratempestrial model, where I'm like, I know what I want to write. If I try to force it, it's never going to happen. If I just kind of sit back and wait for those book angels to come down and help. Actually, a really great example of this is Whitley Strieber. To come back to him in a very different capacity, one thing I learned that this started happening to me after my contact experience, I started having time slips. My sleep was highly disrupted. I would always wake up between 3 and 5 a.m. and it used to drive me insane. I was like, what is happening? I need sleep. I was busy at work and dealing with teenage angst, not my own, but my daughter's. I probably didn't need to clarify that, but my repressed teenage angst coming through in the wee hours of the morning. No, but life was just hard already. I was dealing with this contact experience. I didn't know what to make of it, and I was always up. And sometimes up for like an hour and a half. So I'm listening to Whitley on my friend Kelly Chase's podcast, UFO Rabbit Hole, and he's talking about how that happens to him too. And this conference I went to at Rice University, opening the Archives of the Impossible, that I went to right after my Talking to the Light experience, where I was sort of talking to the light as a sort of a way of seeking comfort in what was happening and all of the traveling and these insane intellectual conversations. At that conference, he was saying he gets up between 3 and 5 to meditate. And I was like, this dude's insane. Like he's setting an alarm, but it's not what happens. He's so tapped in to this other possibly all-encompassing reality that he has just woken up. And there's a name for it. It's called Brahma Muhurta. And it's existed throughout the world and through time, and they gave a name to it in the Hindu tradition. I think that's where it came from. Sounds very Hindu. Brahma Muhurta, where you wake up specifically at like an hour and 46 or hour and 45 minutes before sunrise. And I noticed it was changing too. So in the winter, it would be earlier. In the summer, it would be later. And it's completely linked to sunrise. But what I found is that when this happens, I was looking at it as this horrible thing that made me tired, and I was just grumpy the whole day, which doesn't work well with teenage angst, I'll point out.
No.
There was a lot of headbutting that was happening in my household at that point. But then, after listening to Whitley talk about it, and I got to tell him this story in Esalen and a group of other academics and researchers, after hearing what he does with it is that time there's a lot less interference because there's not a lot of people awake at that time in your general space and time. And you can actually have access to information and energy that you can draw into your body and into your mind during this Brahma Muhurta time that happens. So, and that was a switch for me. I started looking at it completely differently and started to meditate in that time and lay there and focus and draw energy and draw information and use it in a way that was empowering. So as opposed to a detriment, it became an asset. And I was suddenly energized. I had new things to think about, new ways of thinking about them. And yeah, it was something that was new following this new awareness, but also I feel like a change to the physiology of my brain too. Whatever happened on that balcony in Phoenix, I think changed something because I felt the physiological effects of that. My head felt heavy and I couldn't stop crying. And then, yeah, the things with the time and the wakefulness at this specific time, I really flipped the way I thought about it and started to use it as opposed to seeing it as a detriment.
Do you think that when something like that so heavy happens to you, obviously we're humans, we dwell on it because we're like, oh my God, you're questioning everything or whatever. But sometimes as you get farther away from something, the dwelling can get more stressful because you start to wonder, like, wait, did I feel this way about it? Did I feel that way about it? Did this happen? Like, you remember the story, but you're getting farther and farther away. So maybe it, like the ontological shock in a way, kind of increases more. Do you ever feel like there could be instances where, maybe some confirmation bias could come in some of your findings or things relative to you as it relates to this experience you had?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when all of this insane stuff started happening, and I feel bad even using the word insane because that helps perpetuate the bias and the way that we look at it, but these non-conventional things, which began as it did with most people in seeing UFOs. I finally did have a UFO encounter of my own from a distance, but it was clearly non-ordinary and it followed all of the same patterns as a normal UFO does in the nighttime sighting of that sort. But it was shortly thereafter that this wave of strange phenomena started to take place. And recognizing that, I wrote it down. So as it was happening, I wrote it all down so that I would have a pure, unbiased record of those events. I haven't gone back and read it, but it's possible that certain elements of it have been somewhat modified over time. And I absolutely do things now and study things now and look at things in a way I wouldn't without those. Some aspect of that could be biased in that I'm seeking out things that are related to that, not to know something. I'm not looking at it with a specific end in mind or a specific goal, but I've been opened up to new ways of thinking that lead me down a different path. But even in doing that, there's some bias inherent in it. So yeah, I think the problem would be if I was drawing conclusions and then working backward from it, which is the opposite of what I'm doing. I am trying to figure out what it is that happened to me personally. That's my starting point. But also recognizing that there's really no ego in it. It's really more of a quest to understand the world, the universe, the way we're all related, but without any sort of seeking to like confirm something for myself. Like in those moments, I was kind of brought into a space where I felt a collective unity that didn't really leave much space for ego. And that was one of the hardest parts, is that I came away from this experience with a very diminished sense of self. And it's been hard to get that back. I think that was part of the struggle. I went through another sort of dark period pretty recently, actually, about 2 or 3 months ago, where I was trying to get self back. I felt like I was being pulled apart. Yeah, so I guess another way of saying this would be So I recently became chair of my department, and that comes with a lot of work and a really strong focus on collaboration, working with others, doing this job that was hard for me to care about because I had also gotten a foot in this other life.
Yeah.
And it was like my feet were in two different worlds being pulled apart, ripping me up from the bottom, like some sort of James Bond torture device or something. And that was really hard. That stress on my proverbial groin in this metaphor was really difficult. And a lot of it I realized is because I need to be present in this body, in self, in these moments where I'm doing this job as a professor, as a chair, interacting with these things that seem so insignificant because there's these bigger questions. Not that I have answers to those questions, but the seeking and the trying to understand takes you so far out and so far away from where that other foot is that you really do feel stretched apart. So I guess when I say I was seeking self again or seeking a sense of ego, it was in trying to bridge that gap and understand that I am in this body and I am experiencing things and I have to be a part of this world and be present for things and can still ask questions that take me far away from there. I've heard Dean Radin talk about this, where a lot of people who have odd experiences that challenge their notions of reality erect a filter and they can look through that filter. But if you get too far gone, and then it brings up questions of actual mental illnesses.
Yeah.
I just listened to a book about the telepathy tapes and how kids with autism likely are they have a different way of sensing. They can understand, speak telepathically. They can know things without even knowing themselves. That they didn't read a book, but if they know someone that is reading a book, they can just listen to the thoughts of that person and know what the entire
Download
book
it.
is about. Yeah.
Whoa.
So there's all of these ways of understanding where we look at an autistic kid and say, oh, they're dancing around. They have no idea what's going on in reality. They might have a better sense of that, like what Danny Sheehan was talking about, where we might be evolving our consciousness to have that sense that we always had, and we erected these more physical senses that get in the way of that. And stuff like, obviously there's a scale there and people can become dangerous, but if they're at the outskirts of this, if they have schizophrenia, they might have access to something that instead of seen as a mental illness, we should see it as something that should be studied because it might give us insights into different ways that the mind can work in different situations.
Yeah, I think sometimes I've said this before, but when you look at people who are a real genius at something, whatever it is, could be art, could be sports, could be science, anything. Like the creme de la creme, the best there are, there always seems to be some sort of, I don't want to use the word kryptonite, but like they it's almost like they have a price that they pay for that genius.
Yeah.
Right? And so for their mind to be able to work this way, other things are just off. I'll give you an example. Kanye West. Kanye West says certifiably insane shit. Right? And sometimes it gets completely out of control. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to anyone else except him. But Kanye West is audio-visually probably the most genius person to ever walk this earth. He can create sounds and create imagery as well that other people can't even process how you would even get to that point.
Right.
And I kind of wonder if there is something, some sort of, wrong word to use here, but just for the sake of not being able to think of the right one, some sort of bastardization of the consciousness that has to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Neurodivergent people seem to have more abilities or different ways of thinking about things that give them insights. Even traumatic brain injuries. You have people that experienced a car crash and suddenly they can solve complex mathematical formulas. I know a woman personally, I met her in 2019, who was in a car crash, severe brain damage, and became, without having ever painted in her life, an amazing painter.
Whoa.
And I think that works both ways. Like we were talking about with musicians, like music sort of changes your brain structure too. Psychedelics as well, in any sort of way that you can sort of get in harmony with the cosmic existence that we're a part of. I think it works both ways. Like the music comes from that space, but the music and rewiring your brain to be able to do music with other people,
Yes.
especially, because you're creating something together. And sometimes, people are in different moods, you're not vibing. But then there's other times where you know exactly what everybody's playing and how they're playing it, and it just flows so beautifully. It's
What
kind of
is
like,
that?
I don't know, but it happens with other stuff too, like those group mediumship things where, like maybe you've heard Leslie Kane talk about seeing this ectoplasm form into hands, and then she would take molds of these hands, like it actually comes into existence. But one person, spoon bending's another one. These what's it called? PK parties, psychokinesis, where people can bend spoons. It takes that group to be able to bring that energy that helps it happen,
Mm.
with the exception of select few, like not Ingo Swan. I always get him Uri Geller. Like he can just do it.
Yeah.
But it takes usually that group energy that you see in the mediumship and spoon bending with music, art, creativity. But yeah, on an individual level, it almost seems like you have to be a little bit off, and maybe that just allows you to be more open in a way. Maybe it's not just a one-to-one correlation where it changes something in your brain, but just being more open and not seeing the world as everybody else does, like Kanye West. He's like, fuck it, I'm going to make what I make because it feels right to me. And
Yeah.
I'm not being put into this box that we're all supposed to work from, but I'm going to look outside of that box. And that's essentially what a neurodivergent person is walking against the crowd of people walking toward them and seeing things differently.
Yeah, but it also like even beyond the people who are just geniuses, we've done serious psychological studies. We've accessed all these things where people can study across psychologists can study across huge populations how people process things and think of things to get an idea of all the things in our brains that do tie us together.
Mm-hmm.
But I still always say this because it is true. I've only ever lived between my two ears. And everyone else out there, if they think about it, well, that's the truth too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like, what are these small, microscopic things that could be just a little different, even if it's 0.1% in each of us, that make the whole, that in and of itself kind of hides the secret of what this consciousness is all about. You understand what I'm saying?
Oh, I do. Yeah. I completely agree. And what would be the purpose if we were all the same and we all did the same thing and we all
right.
thought the same thing? It takes that polarity in order to do that. Good, bad, positive, negative, whatever we want to call it. But okay, so let's say hypothetically we are here because we are different iterations of source consciousness sent here to learn in order to contribute to the evolution of said consciousness. So the universe can learn about itself,
Yeah.
essentially. This came up recently in a conversation with my wife too, is and kind of harkening back to what we were talking about, is maybe there's things we just can't understand. Not because we, don't ever think about it, we don't ask the right questions, we just can't. A big thing for me is, what is this relationship between this physical existence, which I think is secondary. I think it's an emergent phenomenon that grows out of primary consciousness. And I'm in this body, that's all I have too, is how I perceive things that go in my eyes, that I touch and feel and can think about, limited by the time and space that I exist in, even outside of this body. But when this body exists, this thing I call Michael P. Masters, with his stupid three
right.
names. But this is my only frame of reference, but it's the frame of reference that I am a part of that can, help in all these different ways. But the thing that came up with my wife is, it's like, what would be the fucking point of knowing everything that exists in the land of remembering before we walk across the river of forgetting? What's the point? We wouldn't be here if we had access to that. We wouldn't walk across the river of forgetting if it didn't serve some purpose. So yeah, to your question of how is it all linked together, I think we all have to forget as we come into these bodies seeking knowledge, seeking information, seeking unity with each other, but realizing that we're all coming from a different viewpoint. We see the stimulus different, we see the catalyst differently, but we're still one, all giving back to the same thing.
Yeah,
And that's not my idea. That's not an original idea. That's just from looking at all of these different things associated with what we're talking about, with consciousness and the universe. And
watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here